One of the things I've heard you say is that you're pretty bullish on the likelihood that JD Vance can kind of continue the wins that the rights have accrued here in 2024 in 2028. Can you lay out your case for that argument?
Yeah, well, first of all, I do have to caveat that a little bit, which is to say that in some way, Vance being the sitting vice president is dependent on the success of the administration. So J.D. Vance, who I believe to be a supremely politically talented individual, whose philosophy is in tune with where a center-right majority should be formed, if he is saddled with defeat and depression, the way George Bush was saddled the Republican Party in 2008, no amount of political talent is going to overcome defeat and depression. So I do have to caveat that. The reason I'm excited about Vance is twofold. One, philosophy. Second, talent. Philosophy, the way the Republican Party builds a majority is to represent and bring into alignment the center of the country with its base. It has not done that for 100 years. That this election is the first presidential election since 1928 where more people said they were Republicans and said they were Democrats. And what Americans have wanted for a long time is somebody who understands the role of government in the modern life, but doesn't want government to be controlling. Many Republicans, with the exception of Ronald Reagan, have generally not understood that. They've either been Me Too Democrats, which is not what the center of America wants, or they have been implicitly disdainful of the role of the state in American public economy. J.D. Vance understands that. And so he is well positioned to meet where Americans are on the economy. On foreign policy, Americans want to be internationalists, but not reckless. Which is to say that Americans, when you look at public polls, still support NATO. It's particularly true when you move into the center of the world, center of American public opinion. They want a strong military. They think Russia is an enemy. They think Iran is an enemy. They think China is an enemy. This is something that is shared by Americans. But what they don't want is constant war that, particularly in the last 15 years, ends up in no victory. Americans, like most democratic peoples, want to win wars. They don't want to engage in endless wars. And the foreign policy establishment tends to not mind endless wars. And so Americans don't want that. And J.D. Vance is in that category. He is not an isolationist, but he's not a neocon. And then on social policy, Americans want what I would call chosen tradition. They do not want a world where religion is disrespected, but they don't want a world where we have a de facto endorsement of traditional Christianity in the public square. And Vance is probably a little bit to the right on that one, but he is close enough to the center that I think he can, both in words and deeds, embody that. And so when you look at that, you say J.D. Vance's philosophy is one that can unite the base with the center. And then you look at his talents, and this guy's just whip smart. You look at him, and he can engage with his interlocutors in the modern way that you communicate through interviews and on podcasts in a way that he makes his point. He answers questions, unlike most of these people who are trained to avoid questions. And he comes across as what he is, a genuinely smart and likable guy. And then he can deliver a good stump speech. He can rally up the base. He can attract the middle. And you just look and you say, this is a political talent of generational proportions that also happens to be coming to maturity at a time when that talent will be rewarded, because that's what Americans want. And I think if there is at all a passable success in the Trump administration, this guy is going to cement a Republican coalitional majorities in 2028 and beyond.
Are there other historical precedents that you would point to? Because you said it hasn't been since 1928 that the Republicans had, such a substantial position. But, in modern history, it's Reagan that's usually cited as the golden years. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, well, what Reagan did was bring the Republican Party back from the dead. That when Ronald Reagan was elected, Republicans had about this, you look at polls, and like 22 to 24% of people said they were Republicans. Democrats had 20-point or more edges in name identification. Republicans had not controlled the Senate since after the 1952 election. They had not controlled the House since after the 1952 election. They were non-entities in most state houses. When I was growing up in the mid-1970s, Republicans held 4 trifectas in states, all of them small and rural. What Ronald Reagan did was bring the parties to near parity. By 1985, the Democrats' historic 20 to 30 point gap, which had existed since the late 1950s, had been reduced to single digits, and it stayed single digits for the rest of that time. When Republicans could rally the base, win independence, they could be competitive in most states in the Union. They could win trifectas in state legislatures, and they could consistently compete for control of the Senate, and they could also win control of the House. But it's worth noting that from 1932 until 1980, the Republicans held a trifecta for 2 years. That was 1952 to 1954 with Dwight Eisenhower. From 1980 to 2020, Republicans held a de facto trifecta. I say de facto because the first year or so of Reagan's administration, there were a conservative Democrat / Republican alliance in the House that let them control the floor of the House. For 7 years out of that 40, you can't change a country on that. When you have a trifecta at the national level for 9 years out of 80, you can't change the country. What Vance and Trump can do is flip that so that in the next 40 years, it's the Democrats who have a trifecta for 6 years and the Republicans who have a trifecta for 24 years. And that's how you change the country.
Is there anyone else that you see on the same level of political talent as Vance?
No, because it's a mixture of political talent and political ideas. Is that you've got somebody like Ron DeSantis who may be somewhere in the neighborhood for ideas, but he clearly does not have the political talent. The thing about American politics is the what is what's important. The who eventually arises. The $100 bill lying on the ground of American politics is a conservative populist majority coalition, but it takes somebody of skill to perform it. And for years, you'd take a look and say, there's no who. You've got Trump who's doing it halfway, but he's not all the way. And you've got other people who don't understand it. JD Vance in 2021 was a semi-famous book author, and now he's the vice president of the United States. In American politics, when the who arises, that person rises to the top extremely quickly.
Anyone on the other side of the aisle that you think is an outsized political talent?
You have to match a talent with the ideas, and there is yet nobody on the Democratic side who has figured out how to bring their base in connection with the American center. There seems to be an unwillingness to really understand the difficulties in doing that. Is that the Democratic base is fundamental. The Democratic base that looks at what Joe Biden did on the border and says, what's wrong with that? A Democratic base whose response to the murder of a drug executive is, well, I guess he deserved it, even though people shouldn't kill people. A Democratic base whose response to woke policies is, yes, please, is a Democratic base that remains unwilling to be in connection with the center of public opinion. But again, the what is obvious. The how to get there is devilishly difficult. And if somebody were to arise who could do that, there is no one yet who is. That person could be extremely formidable, but there is as yet nobody who has demonstrated that understanding. So, people who have strong political skills, I would say maybe Josh Shapiro has strong political skills. Somebody like a Gretchen Whitmer seems to have strong political skills, but they have not yet really demonstrated themselves on the national level. Anybody can hit fastballs in AA, to use an American baseball metaphor, but it's hard to hit the wicked breaking stuff in the major leagues. And neither of them have really surmounted to that level yet. I think they'll both try, and we'll see if they're able to do it in 2028.
It's probably a little bit of the Pittsburgher effect where I care 10 times more about the Steelers than anything else that's going on in the NFL. And, both Shapiro and Fetterman, I think for the left have a decent dose of political talent, but yet to be seen whether that can be transferred in a national context.
Yeah, well, Fetterman, I think, understands the problem better so far. The first thing Donald Trump had to break the hold of the establishment on the Republican Party before he could conciliate it. And that was what 2016 was all about. No, I don't have to say that John McCain is a hero. No, I don't have to approve of the war in Iraq. No, I don't have to genuflect before the cross. No, I don't have to genuflect before supply side economics. He broke that by challenging it. What I don't see is anyone in the Democratic Party who wants to break it. Usually what parties, it's risky to do that. So it's understandable why people want to say, well, I can be halfway here and halfway there and blah, blah, blah. No. To change your party, you have to change your party. And that means you have to defeat the power structures in your party, and then you have to bend them to your will to make them happy with the new direction. Ronald Reagan did that. FDR did that. Donald Trump did that. I don't see anyone in the Democratic Party who is, with the possible exception of Fetterman, who is yet willing to go to the mat with the progressive ideas that are dramatically unpopular and say, that's not what Democrats should believe. I'm going to run against that. So we'll see whether or not he is able to do that and is able to branch it beyond some of his issues to make a more core, direct assault on the excesses of the progressive left.